Welcome to the Cinematologists Podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and I am delighted to say, joining me again, back at the helm with me, is my dear friend and collaborator, Dario Linares. Hello, Dario.
Hey, Neil. Good to be back on. Really looking forward to speaking with you today and for the rest of the season. Feels like, I don't know, feels like another renewal of sorts. I don't know, how do you feel about it coming into this first step?
The same. Yeah, it feels familiar but different, you know. It feels like the start of something new in terms of the podcast and its many iterations. Feels like another one, another rebirth, like snakes.
It's like the Alien franchise. It's birth after birth after birth.
Hopefully not the same diminishing returns, but maybe with a Romulus-esque kind of comeback.
Yeah, well, hopefully we keep changing the dynamic and keeping it interesting. I guess that's the main thing, isn't it? I mean, sort of talking with you over the summer about, you know, coming back after the season that's just been, where obviously you were sort of taking it in sort of your direction, which is great. Really enjoyed that. We've talked about it a lot, but then again, discussing it in the context of not just what's going on with me, but also, you know, your own relationship to work and life and academia and creative practice and all these kinds of things, which I think probably is going to be the main thrust of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a good time to reflect and sort of think about what's ahead, not just like you say, because of the sort of changes you've made to your life, which we will talk about today. But just it's a new academic year. Literally I'm recording this in my office, and I walk down the corridor and I can hear the new first years sort of, you know, excitedly huddled outside the cinema, ready to go in for their first screening, like a welcome week screening. So,
okay, so it's welcome week now for you guys. Well, and have you done like a screening, like a choice, what they can pick? Or have you picked something for them?
So the Sound Image Cinema Lab has supported two films which are at Fantastic Fest next week in the States, and one of them is directed by he was an associate lecturer, now he's a contracted lecturer, Dean Puckett, called The Severed Son, and it's a folk horror. So we're screening that as a kind of in-house preview for the first years, and Dean's going to do a Q&A before he flies off.
Oh, that's a feature, is it? Sorry, I'm taking
that's a feature, yes. That's a feature, yeah. So that'll be their screening, and Dean will be sort of doing a Q&A with Laura Canning, who was a producer on the film and also was the second unit director, and she's on the staff here. So yeah, that'll be there. That'll be there, and lovely sort of intro to the film course and the film culture here, which hopefully will go down well. But yeah, it's just that buzz of a new academic year and the sort of the sense of renewal from that, which is really kind of palpable, which is always nice. But I think, it's also been a good, you know, sort of time for the podcast, the award for your Demons of the Mind episode, and an invitation to sort of talk at the AHTV conference by the AHRC in the end of the year. So like everything, there's those kinds of senses of apprehension about new territory, but also buoyed by the sort of the boost from those sorts of things, which, you know, aren't necessarily worth a huge amount in material terms, but they certainly provide a sense of, okay, we're nearly 10 years in and there is an audience, there is recognition, there is a sense that there is value to what we do. And that kind of, I don't know about how you feel about it, but certainly made me feel really good going into a new season, feeling like there's still new avenues and areas that we are impacting with our work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always felt as well that we've never had the time to be able to do that more, you know, as much as probably we might have ideally liked, you know, in terms of recognizing the amount of, for want of a better word, content and the amount of opportunities that could have been fashioned, you know, alongside the simple thing that we do, which is sort of talk to each other about films. And we've done that to certain degrees, but then, and I think in the last couple of years, for both you and I at different points and for different reasons, has sort of become more difficult and more of a job of work, you know, more of a sort of chore. And also turning around that question of whether that's worth doing that, you know?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like, well, it's so much work, and yet it's just piling on to a workload that is just coming from the other end as well, which is obviously now for this season the dynamic of that is going to change quite considerably, and therefore it means that there's an opportunity for the sort of structure of the podcast and how and what we deliver to change slightly, and maybe to sort of expand in different ways.
Yeah, which is really exciting. I certainly feel like, for me in the last couple of years, it got lumped in with work and also bundled in with other creative practice in ways that were not as healthy as I would have liked. And it was really valuable to just take a step back and think, okay, well, what does this mean to me? And I do feel like since then I've got better as a podcaster. Again, like having to carve out headspace for yourself seems, in the jobs that we've had, seems kind of crazy that is something that has to be fought for so much. But when it's done, it does provide a bit of insight in terms of how to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
And reinstigate for yourself what's important about it, and realize that, and I know you've written about this in terms of the podcast and work, the idea that work doesn't love you back, your job doesn't love you back and stuff. So it's kind of like, well, I don't want to see this as part of my job. I don't even want to see it as part of something I feel like I have to do. I just want it to be something that I really want to do and enjoy doing, and attach the value to it that I believe in, rather than what I'm externally projecting.
Yeah, and I don't know how I would have done it. I've got to be honest, Neil. Thinking now, where it's Welcome Week, and I've just sent a book chapter in. These are all kind of, I mean, we'll come to the sort of main thrust of the questions that you're going to ask me about. I think most people know that I've left my academic job for the time being, or my academic kind of institutional role for the time being. Maybe I'm not being clear enough there. I quit. I've not had a sabbatical. I've not kind of like gone, oh well, I'm going to take 6 months off unpaid or anything like that. I've literally just quit. And we can sort of talk about the dynamics of that in a bit. But just on what you're saying there, and sort of listening to you talk a little bit about the Welcome Week, which is always kind of, I always liked Welcome Week, actually. I know people didn't, a lot of academics kind of find it a bit trying, but I always find that renewal quite good. And it was sort of my favorite thing before this sort of shit hits the fan, you know what I mean, really. But just thinking about it now, I've had a book chapter to finish off. I've had an edited book that I'm finishing editing. I'm finishing the index on, and various other things that have sort of been in place that are on the sort of transitional phase. So still a bit of academic work and projects that I need to finish off. And just thinking, God, I've been on this full time. I've been working weekends still, and it's like, where would I have done any Welcome Week prep? Where would I have done any lecture prep? I don't know how I did it in previous years. Just thinking about it,
So today we're gonna talk to each other about what each other's doing. So it's very Ouroboros, navel gazy, but I think both of the kind of the subjects, if for want of a better term, will be familiar to our listeners, and hopefully, we'll get to some really interesting conversation. You sort of alluded to it there, that you've quit your tenured, or we'll call it tenure, but sort of contracted academic post.
Yep.
But you haven't said about what you're doing. So do you want to sort of just talk about sort of not getting to the decision, but getting to the decision to do something else? So not like, because I think, don't we want to go over, we know and people who've read but I think what's interesting is, how did you get to where you are now, in terms of, you don't necessarily have a contracted job to go to, but you do have a career path and a career plan. It'd be interesting to know what that is and how you got to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like a lot of people, the period of COVID, I mean, I know COVID hasn't gone away, but the period of lockdown, let's say, I think everybody experienced a kind of collective, it was a mass social experiment, really, in terms of what are we working for? Now, don't get me wrong, I realize that in certain areas, if you're a doctor or a nurse or what were they called? That phrase that they used, vital worker, essential workers. Yeah. If you were one of those guys, it's like there wasn't really any choice. Or if there was a choice, it was more of a matter of life and death. But I think a lot of people who worked in, what you'd sort of broadly call knowledge economies, and in areas where it was kind of like part of the rat race, let's say, I think a lot of people were sort of looking at themselves in the mirror and thinking, do I want this kind of life? And maybe this is something that has just been brewing under the surface. You know, you could maybe relate it to the way in which now we have this panoramic prism, if that's not a contradiction in terms, with the internet showing us everybody having these amazing lives. And that's fed into our brains 24/7. You know, if we're addicted to those kinds of images, which a lot of us are, but it kind of presents that idea of that's unattainable in the present position that I'm in. You know, so if I'm not working towards having this life that everybody else has got, why am I doing all of this hard work? And then you've got the academic specifics of it, where I felt, I don't know whether the word is undervalued, because it makes me feel like, oh, you know, what is my value? At the end of the day, I think, you know, when you're in a position, when you're in a role in the university, you're being paid because you've accepted a contract in a certain role. So if you're a course leader or you're a tutor, you know, you're course leading or you're tutoring, and that is the focus of your work. But I think up until maybe sort of halfway through my time at Brighton, I felt that compact of having time and having autonomy to be able to do sort of research projects and having a kind of implicit support in doing them was kind of there. And in some ways was what was so attractive about being in academia to begin with, that there was this sense of autonomy that was involved, and the work was creative. And no, it wasn't just the research, you know what I mean? I'm not a filmmaker, I come from a theoretical background, but there was a sort of creativity to the actual, you know, lifestyle in that sense. And, you know, and there's lots of other perks that 9-to-5 people don't have. But I just felt that was kind of being lost. I felt that the bureaucracy and the mechanics of academic life were not enabling us and not enabling students. And it was getting to the point where the narrative of, like as a course leader when you're at open day or when you're just teaching week on week, you know, it's a narrative of why you should be here. And I feel that there was a lot of disillusionment among staff and a lot of disillusionment among students as to the reasons why we're in this situation together. And, you know, the management can sort of talk about they can give all the spiel about student experience and about, you know, a passport to career and employability and all that kind of stuff. But I was always much more interested in the kind of having the students and the tutors having a space where it was an aim of experimentation without there being a sort of goal that was so economically or so prescriptively defined. And so those were sort of broader philosophical kind of feelings that I was having. And then I just got into a situation, again, I don't want to go into too much detail about the specifics. I just got into a situation which was really I didn't particularly enjoy the situation that I was in from all of those perspectives, but on a very much a sort of day-to-day level. So the actual doing of what I was doing was driving me to, you know, physical, you know, I was ill an awful lot of the time. And I'm sure a lot of that was triggered by sort of stress and anxiety. And it was just getting to the point that where I couldn't in all good conscience continue to sell that narrative of you should be here studying with us, you know, and again, not to get all sort of existentialist about it, but I couldn't in good faith feel like I was living an authentic life in that sense, you know. And I just got to the point where there were so many things that I wanted to be doing, and I felt that they were compromised, not enabled with the situation. And I suppose, again, sorry, I know that was a long monologue, but getting to be 50 years old, so there's a level of midlife crisis, and I need to make a change now before it's kind of too late.
But you didn't answer the question. What next? You know, like what? And there are questions attached to this, which is why I wanted to sort of circle back. Like, what's your goal and plan, and what led you to that being? You know, because you could have gone back to working in a restaurant. You could have, you could have taken a course in coding. could have become a Greenpeace activist. You know, there's 100 things you could have done, but you chose to do the thing that you are planning to do. So what is that, and why was that? Why did you think actually this is what I want to do next? Because, and I think I think the reason it's important to talk about is because I think it's attached to everything that you're saying, which almost kind of sees a different way of doing some of the things that you couldn't do in the job that you still believe in fundamentally, even if practically it's at the moment it's completely unworkable.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to talk about. Maybe the reason I didn't answer the question subconsciously is because it's quite difficult to talk about, because it's not, there is a plan, but it's not a plan that has any kind of guaranteed outcomes. Do you know what I mean? So part of it is to do with the fact that I want to basically kind of leverage all of the stuff that I've been doing with the podcast, but also in terms of teaching, and try to figure out if there is a way of doing that on, not necessarily just on an independent level or just kind of like, do online teaching or anything like that, but like a way of engaging with the things that I'm interested in terms of doing the teaching and engaging with people, and also reflecting on kind of the many different aspects of, I mean, one of the things about me is, again, it's probably a problem as well as a strength, is that I become interested in different things quite regularly. You know what I mean? My attention is turned at different points, but there's a way in which I think all of those things feed back together in that idea of using technology and using the media to be able to articulate the ideas and the concepts and and have the conversations that I always found the most interesting thing about academic life, and doing the writing as well. So what I'm definitely going to try and do is sort of use all of that media skills that I've built up through the podcast and through filmmaking, and try to create and, intellectually sort of be creative in a way that then I can put online and use the tools that are out there, but also try to carve out a kind of freelance career which incorporates all of these kinds of different directions. And again, I know that sounds kind of wishy-washy, and I can hear myself saying it, but I actually don't want to commit myself to, I'm going to do this, and this until I'm in the position where I'm like, I've done this. This is what it looks like. So there is going to be involved things like, doing a YouTube channel, and I know in my head what that's going to look like right now, but I want to wait until it's the first part of that is done and it's up there, and then I can talk about it more and you can react to what it is. And also, the part of me is also thinking about all of those things that you said, of retraining in various different types of ways. And the way I'm pitching it in my head is I've got enough leeway from savings that I've got to last me maybe 6 months, maybe even 9 months. So there is time to sort of build those kinds of ideas up. And I've still got loads of opportunities for things like freelancing and academic consultancy and those kinds of things. And, as you've been saying there, we've been offered different events. And I'm hoping that, I'm putting my faith in the idea that if you put things out there that people find value in, then the value will come, not just in the doing of them, but will hopefully open up opportunities that maybe even I can't see yet. Now, again, I don't know how that sounds to you. I mean, maybe it sounds Pollyanna-ish in a way, and by the time January comes around, I'll be a waiter again. But, I don't think that's going to happen, that's for sure.
No, I don't think so either.
Just taking a quick break here to say thanks so much for listening to the podcast. We really appreciate it. This season, we really want to expand on what we can offer listeners. But this does take an awful lot of hard work, both in the planning and organisation, the recording, the editing, and of course, the promotion and sharing of the podcast. What is really key for us this year is our Patreon subscription. The main podcast is going to remain free, but this season, we are offering an early access video recording of the podcast, which you can buy individually or you'll get as part of your subscription. We're also looking to expand our event coverage, such as the London Film Festival, with some guest presenters and editors, and short-form episodes, giving you quick reviews of the films we've seen. We'll still bring you the newsletter, of course, and our bonus episodes. We really want to turn the Cinematologists into something that can be sustainable on an economic basis. So if you have been a long-term listener, please consider joining the Patreon membership so you can get access to all this material. If you're a new listener, welcome aboard. We really appreciate having you. And if you like what you hear, please also consider joining us. You'll find a link to our Patreon account in the show notes, or you can just Google Patreon Cinematologists. Come and join our space of passionate, informed, and eclectic conversation about cinema and film culture. But now let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got a plan, and it sounds like you know what you're doing, and it doesn't sound like you just kind of like sacked it in because you've kind of fed up. It sounds like you're trying to kind of find a way to retain what was meaningful about the vocation of being academic, with sort of newfound circumstances, which made me sort of think about a question around identity. I think because you've got this great series on your Substack about sort of post-academic life, and I think I sort of said to you about kind of considering yourself as a kind of independent researcher and talking about yourself in that kind of space. And I just wondered how you feel about the identity of being an academic, because I think that more and more, conferences are attended by independent researchers. More and more people seem to be doing PhDs, but that doesn't mean anything in terms of what it used to mean in terms of career progression or security. Having a PhD it's not a competitive way to get a job anymore. There's no jobs. And, there seems to be much more of a climb. And also, even if you have a research profile, you're almost a kind of independent academic within an institution if you don't align with university strategic objectives and you don't have funding attached,
Yeah.
So I've always found it interesting the way we've talked about being an academic, and wonder if this is what's really exciting about this for me, is sort of seeing you almost imagining a new way of being an academic, not throwing it away, but saying, actually, this is not a job, as in it's not you go into a specific place. It's something else. It's a configuration of practices, configuration of philosophies and approaches, and seeing you do that in a different space, I think is really, really exciting. So I just but I know the reason I wanted to ask, because I know that identity, self-identity, and the idea of an academic is something that you think a lot about. So where are you at with that right now, and how do you feel about that kind of thinking?
Well, I come more and more to the realization that these labels really kind of don't mean anything in some ways. I guess if I was to say that I am an academic, I haven't felt like one for a while, right? So I felt more like a lower middle manager and, an accreditation consultant for students, and often not a student support officer, because that's, that alludes to something very specific, I think, but somebody who spends an awful lot of time doing things like akin to counselling, pastoral care, that kind of stuff. And don't get me wrong, I think all of these elements, again, are part of that academic researcher combined profile, I think, that has underpinned what academic jobs have been in the UK, particularly in the post-92 sector, I think. Again, it's like, I think you're right. It's an interesting question, because it's like, I don't want to sort of start calling myself a content creator, because that alludes to something. I'm definitely not going to be an influencer. It's just like ridiculous to even think about it in those terms. But yeah, even like calling myself a writer, I find problematic. I mean, podcaster, again, I could say, yeah, I'm definitely a podcaster, but podcasting, I think, doesn't have that history of specifics in terms of, like, if you're a commercial podcast, if you make money from it, you call yourself a podcaster. But if you're not, if you're just, quote unquote amateur, or you're academic like we are, nobody's going to pull you up for calling yourself a podcaster. Whereas I think, unless you're sort of published, unless you've written a novel and a short story collection, are you really a writer? Or, and again, I suppose that's the difference between sort of talking about a critic and a writer. You could have a column in a newspaper and be a film critic, but are you a writer in that, writer in that sense? So there's a lot of kind of kudos and hierarchical projection of what you are. I think that I did align with having a PhD and also being an academic in terms of being a tenured academic. And I think I'm trying to let those things go so that I can then free myself up to be interested in just the things that I'm interested in, and not necessarily even worry so much about research. But I mean, don't get me wrong, I think it's interesting because I think that the ability to be able to do this, part of it is economic, but part of it is based on the fact that I do have a research profile that goes back, and I have worked in academic jobs for 22 years now. So going online, I can actually say that as a starting point. It said, this is why you should listen to me. If you go online and you haven't got any of that and say, listen to me about films, then you're just, Dario in his bedroom waffling on about films, which is kind of maybe what I am anyway. So it's, you know what I mean? It's a tricky one to answer in that sense, but I'm definitely trying to move away from that sort of sense of these identities that I affix a position to, affix a hierarchical kudos to. I get kind of fulfillment out of knowing that I in my head that I am that. I'm more interested in the doing of the thing now.
Yeah. Which is great, and I do want to sort of come back to that because it's interesting because obviously like it's being so close to you doing it, kind of throws up questions which I think are really interesting, and they're not necessarily things that you're engaged with, but they certainly bring to the surface in a very direct way this question of like, what is an academic? Because I think that almost increasingly there's a sense that being an academic is something that you do in spite of working at a university,
which is terrible.
It is terrible. I mean, it's I was going back to what you were saying earlier about the value placed on you, like feeling undervalued. I think that, reading this book on, the academic in the neoliberal university, kind of 2020 book about, which is a kind of collection of all this thing, and this kind of Marxist idea of the worker. And it's not necessarily a feeling undervalued because, like you say, it's a capitalist institution, it's a capitalist machine. But there is a sense of it's increasingly dehumanizing, and actually the recognition that you can put 85 things on a spreadsheet and make it work, that this is a person's job, and say, do this, But that completely removes the fact that it's people doing this job from it, and what it is to do those tasks cannot be distilled into. And we've talked about this before, like, it takes you 15 minutes to mark a 6,000 word dissertation based on X formula. They put that in a spreadsheet and say, that's what you, and I find it in, that's what's kind of interesting is to see you kind of then going out and thinking, well, actually, I have had to go outside the academy to do things that used to be, and still are kind of philosophically, or at least kind of hopefully, I don't think it's Pollyanna-ish. I think it's still tied to a kind of very real and important ideal of a university and an academic life. You're having to think, well, I'll go out and do this because I can't do it. I can't do it within the space where it should exist. And I find that interesting. And I did want to ask before, because I want to talk about your interests and sort of film and stuff like that. But one question I had was like, and you talked about many things there, content creator, influencer, and they're not necessarily words that they're not things you're going to do, but they conjure up a certain idea of kind of entrepreneurialism, in a kind of space. And I just wondered how you feel about and how you're squaring kind of stepping away from the institution with its capitalist machinery and kind of almost crushing neoliberalism, and then ending up in a space where
it's the same.
you're still going to have to deal with all of that, and that I find that. I'm curious as to how you're feeling about that.
Well, I think it's difficult because I think there is a hypocrisy there without a shadow of a doubt. And I obviously I on my own are unable to refashion a new kind of academic system in that sense.
Come on, Dario. Why not?
Get on with it. You know what I mean? Reinvent the university. I think part of it is a thoroughly problematic because I am. If you can't beat them, join them. It's like I'm going to take what I am and can deliver and do and my expertise and my skills, and I'm going to offer that in a independent commercial kind of environment, or and use the mechanisms of the entrepreneurial side of the internet to do that, and therefore I will not live and die, but I will succeed or fail on the back of my individual ability, and work rate and all of those kinds of things. And I do think it is very difficult to. I can't see a way in which institutional academia reforms in any short space of time where it doesn't get a lot worse before it gets better. What I can actually see is a massive rupture happening, and in some ways, the way I've thought to myself is, I want to be on the up curve of that bell curve. I want to be on the upswing of it rather than on the downswing of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, if you look at a lot of the research, the tech companies, God love them, and a lot of commercial industries are investing in education because I think that they can see this on the horizon. And I think students, in some ways, a lot of students are still going to university because it's kind of still. It still retains the kudos, and it still retains the potential outcomes that are advantageous depending on what university you go to, what course you're doing, and how you make sense of the time. But I think more and more students are kind of leaning into that sort of sense of individual curation of their own education, and I think that that's where the big rupture is going to start to come. But also, having said that, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy from individual academics in institutions as well, in terms of, if you carve out a nice little position for yourself where you can do what you want to do, I think, a lot of that's the kind of aim of a lot of academics. And when they get that, they'll fight tooth and nail to hold on to it. And I think it's interesting, just writing this blog has been interesting because I think that there are two narratives that I think a lot of academics engage with, and I'm guilty of it as much as anyone else. Where on the one hand you say universities are wonderful and they do all of these things, and they do, but on the other hand they've got all of these kind of problems which are fundamental to the way that they're run and the way that they're financed. And also, if we're being honest, and I know nobody likes to say it, but there is mediocrity out there. What is the answer? I turn it back to you, in terms of how do you deal with it as well? Obviously you're staying, and is that because you genuinely want to stay? You believe still in the institution you're at. You believe in higher education in its form and over the next 10 years, or is it more of a pragmatic decision? You know what I mean? And you don't have to answer that, but that's a decision obviously everyone is making.
Yeah, I don't mind answering it. It's both. I don't know how I'd feel if I didn't have two kids and also be approaching 50. So in terms of the pragmatics, that's a big thing. And Beth and I talked a couple of years ago about, committing to Falmouth as a place to raise the kids, kind of always having, in an academic job, always having an eye elsewhere and thinking, maybe we could go and looked at some jobs and did a couple of interviews, and it would have been a case of completely restarting again. I wouldn't have been able to port anything that I was doing in terms of the big projects that I developed here. So it's like I've got to start again. And also I've got to start again in a job which is not much more money, but also includes, two other parts that I do, like a management thing where I have to manage a group of people, which I don't have to do now. So it's like, what am I actually moving for? And thinking that my university, Falmouth, is still a place where you can get through certain things that I don't think you get through anywhere else, So there are still those times when it's worth the battle, because you have those little wins, which are quite significant in terms of the work that you want to do. But I was talking about this to someone this morning, someone I hadn't seen since I became a professor, and they said, how is it? And I was like, interesting question. And my job didn't really change from senior lecturer to associate professor. Kind of very little. There was a nice little kind of ego boost, but the day-to-day reality of the job was kind of the same. Whereas the step up from associate professor to professor has been markedly different. And now I sit in an institutional space, which I didn't really before. And the expectation on me is to be present for so much bureaucracy. And over the summer, I was looking back on the last year, which I knew was going to be very different because it's the first year in a new role. And I was kind of expecting it to make this kind of shift. But there was a sense of looking back and realizing actually I did nothing in terms of the things that put me in that position on paper.
Yeah.
You know, like I know they're not employing me because they want me to do more projects. They're employing me because they want me to sit on committees and consult on things because that's a space that needs filling at the institution. I'm very aware of that. But there is that tension of like, well, how do I, in the upcoming academic year, how do I retain my job role, but also really think about committing to the work I want to do, which is not consult on a new IP strategy or fill in yet another report. Like, I understand there's a need for that because that's the model, that's the machinery, but I also want to carve out space to go back to the stuff I was interested in, and again that's kind of got me in that position in the first place. And that's really hard because it's having to say no, which is really hard to do in a system which feeds on people like me and my insecurity about saying no. I don't like saying no because I'm scared that if I say no, they'll fire me. That's a long history of insecurity, which somewhere like a university with its kind of inbuilt competitiveness feeds on subconsciously. So yeah, it's really complicated, isn't it, in terms of like the reasons that people stay and go.
Yeah.
It's messy as well, in terms of like I can't square it all the time.
No. Nobody can, but everybody has to justify the narrative in some way, don't they? And it's not just academia; it's every walk of life, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I just couldn't. I mean, again, and maybe if I had kids, it would be a different story entirely, obviously. But I got to the point of thinking I have never filled in a report that I think has had any material impact. And I must, you know what I mean? Any material impact whatsoever. And it's just kind of that sort of thinking of, I'm 50, I'm going to die soon. I mean, I know that sounds morbid.
Not too soon, I hope.
Well, not too soon. But you know what I'm saying? It's like, you get to a point, it's the midlife crisis. It's like, do I want to do this for the next 15 years? And I had it was interesting. I had a chat with my mum and I was kind of quite worried because, as you said, she's a working class. It's still the working class idea that, you don't quit a job unless you've got another one lined up because of that anxiety that you talked about. And it's like, she said to me, look, to be honest with you, I spent the last 15 years of my last job waiting for the pension and I just didn't want to go to work every single day. And it's like, you think about it, 15 years is a long time to not want to go to work.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I don't think I can do it,
Yeah. No, fair dues. And I wanted to know about where film fits in terms of your thinking, because I think one of the things that we talked about around taking a break from the podcast was, the sense that film is a chore, it becomes a chore. And, it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that's really kind of that boggles people's minds about, because, if you talk to someone who doesn't work in a university, their idea of a university academic is one of immense privilege where you kind of sit around and spaff about whatever it is. So their idea is that we will sit around and we'll talk about Bresson for 3 hours, and it's like, I can't remember the last time I mentioned Bresson in this building, even in passing, even like, oh, who's thrown away that book on Bresson? Like, just nothing. Film is a very, very, very small part of my day.
Yeah.
And I'm a film professor. I'm a film academic. And it's a fight to stay excited and interested in the subject, which I think, again, is kind of madness. But part of the course, so I wondered about, how much, not how much, because I don't think it's a huge part, but like, are you excited about your relationship with film shifting in a different way because you're kind of free from it being so toxically tethered to this very, very constraining job?
Yeah, I think it's started to happen already, because I think what it kind of aligns with. And it's not just film; it's the pleasure of doing the things that actually were pleasurable, but as part of the job. Maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. So even like preparing the lecture, or watching the film, or setting a reading, or setting questions for the reading. These were all chores, and in some ways maybe they should be, and you should stop moaning about that being your chore when people have got to do, jobs that people have to do in quote unquote, I'm going to say the real world, but you know what I mean? And yeah, I was at the point, and part of it was, I'm just not interested in cinema enough at the moment to be able to sort of come on here and sort of say, this is brilliant, this is life-changing. And I think what's started to happen is there is started to be a shift where I don't feel like I've got anybody telling me that I need to do this thing in order for this other thing to get done. It all being linked up in that kind of way. Like say, for example, we're going to speak on the next podcast about your book, and it's just been great. I've watched like 6 music documentaries over the weekend, and it was just a case. And yes, I was doing it for the podcast, but especially watching there's one that I watched that I was just like, Jesus, this is so inspiring. It makes me want to get on the computer and start, do my next project, and get the sound right and all of that, all that kind of stuff. Because when you watch something that you engage with, it really sort of sparks that ideal, that sort of that sense of intuitive joy when something touches you. And this is all, to be honest with you, apologies for those of you who have been following the Substack, because I can feel the sentences that I've just written this morning, because my next Substack is going out. They're just coming out on this podcast, so you're going to get it twice over. Sorry about that, but yeah. So I've written about that idea of the dichotomy between following your passion and being pragmatic, and I think that that's a false dichotomy at times, and sometimes it isn't. But I think that the balance had gone for me. And it was like, even the stuff that was the stuff that I got into this for was becoming a chore. It's like, I don't want to watch this goddamn film and then try and put it into context for these students who, 70% of them won't have watched it. And I want to get that. I want to kind of get that spark back in terms of engaging with the subjects. And it started to happen because I do want to read some stuff again, and I do want to watch stuff again, and just sort of preparing for the podcast, and even like the equivalent of the bureaucracy that you see in university, which is stuff like doing social media and doing the promotion and stuff. I'm actually quite excited for that element of it as well, and sort of expanding the Patreon aspect and actually making it a challenge. Can I actually utilize this stuff and repurpose all of my work to try and build some kind of audience where I can work in that way. I can work in that way and be paid for it enough for it to be worthwhile.
Yeah, exciting. So yeah, it's nice to hear you talk excitedly, which I guess is kind of the last question I wanted to ask, which is maybe a big question, maybe too philosophical, but like how do you want to feel about yourself? But at this point in your life, with this huge change, what are you hoping for in terms of just how you feel as a person at this time? Because I think it's a really exciting, terrifying, kind of amazing time, really. And it's just, it's nice to hear you talk excitedly about it, rather than, which I know is obviously a transition period, but rather than exorcising the pent-up disgruntlement, which is obviously a big part of it. It's exciting to see it become something else.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to have that feeling back again, where you actually go to bed looking forward to getting up. And Jenks reminded me of that. He I think he said that on possibly an interview with you, but he said it somewhere. And it reminded me, because I just identified with the feeling so much. There were times when I was younger where it's like I went to bed and it was like, I know at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to be so ready for the day and stuff. And there was, to be honest with you, the sort of first few years when I was down at Falmouth, I had that feeling. I used to love to get up in the morning, and because I knew I liked where I was and I liked my colleagues, and I felt like the work was interesting, and then again, don't get. again, one of the things I've said in this blog is like you can't be Pollyanna-ish about the fact that work is always going to be difficult. Otherwise, it's not worthwhile. Even the stuff that you love to do is hard. Sometimes sitting down and doing the editing of the podcast, if you're going through it, God, this is going to take me like 5 hours to do this editing. And you're like, okay, but there is a sort of, in the practice of doing it, then you get the value and you get something that's worthwhile. And I also just want to feel like that, again, I'm not telling an inauthentic story. I'm not pretending. I'm not performing in a way that is that is designed to be an instrument of, I'm working for this organization and I'm kind of sawing the rough edges off, or I'm nuancing how great this is going to be.
Yeah.
In certain ways, which I did feel like was the case. I mean, I always would back, like, say, for example, one of the things I always said, if somebody said, was oohing and ahhing about their coming to university and said, look, I would always vouch for the fact that this is my course and your son or daughter or, whoever who's coming to study here will, if they're in the room with me, it'll be worthwhile. Because I vouch for what I'm teaching, you know what I mean? And even if it's not, because I actually vouch for the fact that my teaching about film is a jumping off point to philosophy, to social science, but also to things like confidence, to things like resilience, to things like being curious, and then, a jumping off point to getting a job.
Yeah.
But that was, way low down. I was interested in those other things. So not having to sort of feel like that I'm telling a story that I don't believe in anymore about what I represent. I think moving along from that, and then again, I to the pragmatic element, I've got to get to the point where it's kind of like, okay, so even if I go back to university, I might have to make a decision where it's, look, I'm going to go back and be a manager, and I'm going to do a 9 to 5 because, it is what it is. You've got to live, but then you have to find a sort of sense of, okay, so what is worthwhile within this role?
Yeah,
because I just lost it. I'd lost what it was in the particular circumstance I was in.
Yeah, isn't it funny that when you said like you're interested in teaching or helping students learn confidence, resilience, and curiosity, ultimately 3 of the traits that will help you get a job.
Yes.
Which always kind of makes me laugh. That the thing, in terms of being an academic, in an institution which is telling you what to teach, and you're sort of saying, actually, what we're teaching already and how we're teaching it is the best thing to help people get jobs. And I always find that an interesting conversation. As this has been an interesting conversation. So yeah, thanks for being so open about where you're at, because I think it is a huge moment for you and for the podcast, and I'm excited to see what that means for us. Because I think it's interesting from because you're sort of saying all that stuff, and I'm like I'm on the same trajectory. I can't really shift right now in terms of like where this fits, and I don't want it to, because I've been enjoying it so much for the last couple of years since I came back. With you. Before doing it on my own, like it's been so enjoyable. So I'm really interested to see what this means for the podcast. I'm sure it only means good things because we're still here and we're still doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to, again, if you've got to this point and you're one of our regular listeners, you've got to the end here, then well done. Thanks very much for listening thus far. There'll be much more film talk on the next podcast. But I think just to sort of reiterate and kind of, I don't want to say reassure, but it's just going to mean more cinematologist content, and we are going to sort of reshift a little bit. The main feed is perhaps going to be more of me and you, maybe, and we're going to have the interviews and the stuff that we do outside will come in as snippets, but then that will go over to the Patreon because, like I say, I think I don't want to get into the habit of sort of overly begging for money for the podcast and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, when we put a lot into this, and I think now that I'm shifting over, there has to be a little bit of sort of step change in the way that we manage the content. But there will always be a couple of episodes a month that people can listen to for free, and we just hope that we can kind of expand the base, offering the extra stuff, which again, like I say, will be expanded going forward.
Yeah, and also I think one of the exciting things is we've got a very loyal Patreon, following, who've done us an amazing job of keeping us in, funding to do things and pay for things over the last few years. And it also feels, in addition, a nice opportunity to give them stuff that we've really tried to do, but because of our jobs have not been able to do. Whereas this feels like, okay, this is a time to also give back to that listenership as well as build a new one, which is again really exciting because we're so grateful for that continued support, which almost comes, because they know they value what we do, and that's really meaningful, and that feels like real value in a world where it's sometimes hard to discern.
So please support us if you can.
Yes, thank you.
The other thing I've noticed, Neil, which I'm going to do from now on, just for listeners, is if you want to listen to one particular interview that comes up, you don't have to sign up for a monthly commitment, which you can always cancel at any point anyway. But you can kind of buy individual bits of content if they speak to you specifically. So I'm going to start putting that up on the Patreon as well. I've started doing that already with previous stuff. So if there's an interview or something that you wanted to get a hold of, but you just wanted that one thing, then you can do that now on the Patreon.
Oh, great. That's good to know. Yeah, that's really good to know. Cool. All right. So, end of part 1, I guess.
Yeah, thanks very much, Neil. It's been great. Really, really loved it. Looking forward to the rest of the season, and we're going to focus on your amazing book in the next episode.
Cool. So thank you everyone for joining us for this new season. It's great to have you back, Dario. Great to have you all back with us, our listeners. And we will be back very shortly. But for now, this has been the Cinematologists Podcast. Thanks for listening.